the San Juan Islands, the crown jewels of the Salish Sea. Located in the Pacific Northwest, this archipelago was the stage for a strange event that nearly led to an armed conflict between Great Britain and the United States of America. In 1846, Britain and the United States signed the Oregon Treaty to define the boundary between British North America and the United States of America. However, the defined boundary through the Salish Sea was ambiguous at best. The treaty stated that the border would follow the 49th parallel to the Strait of Georgia, then south, following the middle of the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver's Island to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. However, the middle of the channel was not clearly defined, and both American and British were settling on the islands. On one fateful day in 1859, an American colonist discovered a pig rooting through his garden. It was not the first time he made this discovery, and thus took to his gun and ended the poor swine's life. It turned out the pig belonged to a British colonist who settled nearby. The situation escalated to the point of a military build-up known as the Pig War. Eventually, news of the event had found its way to Washington, D.C. President James Buchanan was preoccupied with the political tensions in the American South leading up to the American Civil War. The San Juan Islands were small and far away, so Buchanan sent General Winifred Scott to the islands to resolve the issue. When General Scott arrived, he discovered a much larger British naval presence than he expected. Governor James Douglas of the colony of Vancouver Island had been hard at work recruiting as much British naval power as he could muster. Douglas was a former high-ranking officer of the Hudson's Bay Company and had powerful connections which he leveraged at this important time. The American settlers on the island were ready to fight and defend what they believed was theirs, but General Scott stayed their hand to prevent further conflict. His best efforts to relay information to the president came without response. As the weeks wore on, tensions rose as the settlers on both sides grew restless and frustrated, but the British naval presence seemed to grow each week. One cold day in winter, General Scott caught word that some of the American settlers were banding together and preparing an attack on the British. Still without direction from the president, General Scott took the American settlers into custody and began withdrawing troops from the islands. Many lives were spared that day due to the swift actions of General Scott. Several days later, he met with Governor Douglas at the southeastern tip of San Juan Island and relinquished control of the islands to the British. General Scott returned to Washington to deliver the news to President Buchanan. Scott was furious that Buchanan had ignored the situation and not provided direction nor resources to maintain control over the islands. Buchanan was upset that Scott withdrew from the islands, stating that it was an embarrassment to the Americans at a time of internal conflict. Behind closed doors, Buchanan thanked Scott for not escalating the conflict with the British, but publicly denounced his withdrawal and fired him. However, other politicians saw through the farce, and Buchanan's political image was damaged even further. Buchanan did not run in the federal election the following year and was succeeded by Abraham Lincoln. Meanwhile, back in the Pacific Northwest, Governor James Douglas declared the islands to be part of the colony of Vancouver Island, and the British settlers celebrated their victory. Douglas restricted any further settlement or development on the islands until tensions in the region subsided. The established farmers were allowed to stay, including any law-abiding Americans if they so wished. First Nations that inhabited the islands were also permitted to stay. Ultimately, the colony of Vancouver Island consolidated with the colony of British Columbia and joined Canada several years after Confederation to form the province of British Columbia. In a surprise move upon Confederation, Douglas presented a document stating the undeveloped lands of the San Juan Islands would become a heritage site and protected park in honor of the peace agreement with the United States. The location where Douglas and Scott met was named Scott Point. Over the years, the islands were practically lost to history as they were undeveloped, and many of the farms went into abandonment. Fast forward to the summer of 1967, almost 100 years after Canadian Confederation. A student from the University of Victoria was working an internship for the provincial government and was tasked with organizing legal documents in the basement of the parliamentary building. The days wore on, in the dark rooms filled with boxes, overflowing with old documents. Often they were uninteresting, and sometimes the handwriting was nearly illegible. This was not the task for a young man with great political aspirations. He was beginning to tire and become disillusioned with the task at hand. One afternoon in June, the young man came across an old and confusing document. It stated that the San Juan Islands were on a 99-year lease to the colony of Vancouver Islands from the Hudson's Bay Company. He took the document to his superior, who could not make sense of it. It was signed by James Douglas on July 20th, 1871, the day BC joined Canada. Over the following days, the document was authenticated, and no other documents to prove government ownership of the islands were found. The intern's superiors told him to keep quiet while they tried to discredit the document and sweep it under the rug. The intern became increasingly frustrated. He realized the 99-year lease was soon coming to an end, and the rightful owner of the islands should be aware of the situation. One evening, he took the document from his superior's office and set off for the Pacific headquarters of the Hudson's Bay Company. In recent years, the Hudson's Bay Company had rebranded its department stores to The Bay and undergone aggressive expansion. The investment had drained the company financially, nearly to the point of bankruptcy. Upon news of this document from the intern, the general manager of the Pacific Division called an emergency meeting with the board of directors. After much discussion, the CEO of Hudson's Bay contacted W.A.C. Bennett, Premier of British Columbia, to discuss the matter. Bennett, who was still unaware of the existence of the document, denied its authenticity and dismissed HBC. But the HBC board was desperate and persistent. They took the province to court. It was a long and drawn-out case that further drained the HBC, but they knew the value of the land would well be worth the effort. After several years of battling in the courts, a judge in the Supreme Court of Canada finally ruled the document to be legitimate and awarded HBC as the owners of the lands described in the document, which was the entirety of the San Juan Islands. This was a major windfall for the HBC. The intern was rewarded handsomely by the HBC. He received a lump sum that ensured he would never need to work another day in his life. The following months were chaotic at the HBC Pacific headquarters. They received many offers from land and resource developers. The company would still need to pay its debts from their expansion and legal fees. However, the media was not kind to the HBC throughout the court case. Some went as far as calling it the greatest theft of the century. The Bay department store's sales were at an all-time low. Now on damage control, the board made several bold decisions. First, they announced that any land occupied by the First Nations prior to 1967 would retain their land. Additionally, they announced several large areas of land that would be dedicated to the government to form provincial parks. Another area of land was donated to the University of Victoria to develop a new campus in the region. This decision was widely applauded by the academic community, as it offered a unique opportunity to study and preserve the region's rich cultural and natural history. The HBC had been strategic throughout this process. Prior to the announcement, they had been conducting surveys of the land and kept the most resource-rich and developable land for themselves. Parcels began to be divided up and sold to the highest bidder. Forestry companies would be brought in to clear land for development. Farmers were taking interest in the more arable areas of the islands. Mining companies were sending out exploration crews to collect samples. Gravel magnates were searching for the best locations for their pits. Roads would need to be built, and a good gravel pit can be as lucrative as a gold mine. Property developers were hiring planners, architects, and engineers to develop new communities. Parcels were divided up, and individuals from across the country were making their bids to be part of the most exciting Canadian development of the century. To this day, it is still debated why Governor James Douglas wrote that document and kept it secret. It ultimately did benefit the company he previously worked for, but it would only benefit them after he was long gone. Maybe that was the point. And why was it secret? This will remain one of Canada's greatest mysteries for years to come. But now, there is work to be done. Developers are anxious to get started on the first of their communities. And if they prove successful, perhaps their grand vision for a modern metropolis may become reality.